the great years of the fifth generation, which is when films like Red Sorghum and Horse Thief were made, are the second half of the 1980s. Things begin to change for all kinds of complicated reasons in the 1990s. And although some of the key figures of the fifth generation continue to make films after 1990, it's not quite the same. It's never quite the same again after that. So the main thing to stress first, I think, is that the fifth generation films, the classics of the fifth generation, were made in the very final years of the old communist studio system in China. China still had a state-run film industry in the 1980s, and it was not until the 1990s that private companies began to invest in film, and that films were no longer particularly closely associated with one production city in China. Films became more international, and there was much more foreign investment in China as well as private Chinese investment in film. So these are films made within the state system, within the 16 studios that the party had created right across China. Some very big ones like Shanghai, Beijing, Changchun, but most of them, the others, were mostly small. And the studio in Xi'an was sort of medium-sized. It's a sort of middle-sized studio. Its designated output each year was to be 10 films, or possibly 11 if they were very economical. And the studio had been headed since 1983 by a filmmaker called Wu Tianming. And Wu Tianming was very popular with the staff. He was considered widely to be a very good man and to have very good ideas about reforming the studio and the way it was run. And Wu Tianming tried very hard to rationalize the operation of Xi'an Film Studio. It was difficult because he had far too many staff. There were something like 4,000 people attached to the studio as workers. And he once said to me that of those 4,000, maybe 1/3 were very useful and very productive crew members and staffers in the studio. Maybe 1/3 were okay, they didn't contribute anything very much, but they didn't get in the way. And the final third were actively obstructive. They actually made it harder to make films in the studio, as well as being a huge financial drain on the studio, because they had to be housed, they had to be given health care, they had to be, their kids needed education. There were all kinds of ancillary costs that the studio had to bear, and in return they got, in Wu Tianming's view, nothing from some of these people. So it was a very difficult situation. There were also complicated things about the way that films were distributed in China at the time. There was a monopoly company called Zhongying Gongsi, which was responsible for domestic distribution and for foreign sales of Chinese films. They had the monopoly in both these areas. So Wu Tianming was one of the studio heads who negotiated a better deal with the China Film Corporation, as it was called in English. Instead of just getting money from selling copies of films to the main central office and then having them distribute them around the country, he negotiated a deal whereby he would get a percentage of box office grosses, which was, on the face of it, a much better deal, but in practice was a difficult one because the money came back much more slowly to the studio from this system. If you sold outright, which was the old way of doing it, copies of the film, then you got the money immediately and you could use it for your next projects, whatever. But if you were working on a percentage of box office, you had to wait until the distribution was over before you got the money, which was quite a lot later. It might be a whole year later. So it was difficult. And at the time that Wu Jianming took control of Xi'an Film Studio, he told me the studio was many millions of yuan in debt to the bank. It was because it was a state industry, it was allowed to have a very big credit line at the Bank of China, but it was not a healthy way for any business to operate with a vast debt to the bank. And one of the reasons that Deng Xiaoping argued for privatization of some of the old state industries, including the film industry, was that he felt the only way forward was for these industries to stand on their own feet financially. They had to be self-supporting. So the move from the end of the 80s onwards, and it went into the 1990s, was to denationalise the film industry, to make it a private industry, still subject to the usual censorship controls and other things from the central government, but to be self-supporting, self-financing, so studios were given their own responsibilities for distributing and marketing their films, and for foreign sales even, which was very difficult for many studios because they had no staff competent in those areas. They didn't know how to start doing it because it had always been done by China Film Corporation. So it was a difficult time. Anyway, in this climate, Wu Tianming was a very different studio head from any of the others across China. Perhaps because he was a filmmaker himself, he had a very clear sense that it was necessary to make commercial films which would pay the bills, would attract a significant audience and would bring in money and resources to the studio. But at the same time, it was necessary, he thought, to make what he called yishupian, art films, or tanshuopian, experimental films, which would advance Chinese cinema. He put it in terms of face. When I discussed these questions with him, he said, it's a question of face. I need face. I don't want face just from box office success. Like perhaps Shanghai Film Studio seems to be happy with that. I want face from prestigious achievements. I want to be known as somebody who not only made commercially successful films, but also artistically successful films, artistically adventurous films, films that pushed forward the language of Chinese cinema and modernized the film industry in China. So he was remarkably successful at doing that for those few years of the late 1980s. And he attracted many of the so-called fifth generation directors who were scattered around China, and he said to them, come to me, come to work in Xi'an, and we'll discuss it, but I'd love you to make the films you've dreamed of making. So I'm not going to impose conditions on you. I want you to make great films. Well, one of the first to respond to this was Tian Zhuangzhuang, who was in a rather difficult position personally, and we'll discuss that on the disc of Horse Thief. Zhang Yimou was a slightly different case. Zhang Yimou graduated in 1982, but he graduated from the cinematography department. So, whereas other people like Chen Kai-ge, Tian Zhuangzhuang, Hu Mei, many others, graduated from the directing department and made their way rather naturally into directing films, Zhang Yimou had a rather more tricky path. He made his first film, or worked on his first feature anyway, the year he graduated, 1982, which is a film called Hongxiang, Red Elephant, film for children. Co-directed by Tian Zhuangzhuang and two other graduates, both of them not so famous these days, and produced by Tian Zhuangzhuang's mother, Yu Lan, the former actress, who was the head of the children's film studio. So there may have been some connection between the studio and that. Anyway, Zhang Yimou was hired as, I think, an assistant cameraman on this film. And after making it, he was assigned on graduation to the Guangxi Film Studio in the deep southwest of China. I think it's in the city of Nanning. And in Guangxi, it was a very tiny studio with very few established directors on its books. It turned out to be rather easy for the fifth generation to start making films very quickly. There were no senior figures in the studio who were clamoring, saying, I go first, I have first claim on the studio's resources this year, so you have to wait, you have to wait maybe 10 years before you get the chance. That didn't happen in Guangxi in the way that it did happen in bigger studios. So very soon after he joined, another graduate from the directing department of the Film Academy, a man called Zhang Junzhao, made a film called Yiger和八个, The One and the Eight, based on a rather famous poem at the time. The film ran into all kinds of censorship problems and there was some reshooting had to take place, but Zhang Yimou photographed this film. And many people agreed that the film was very striking for its look. It looked very different from other Chinese films of the time, in fact ever actually. It was a very new look in Chinese cinema. And he, having had this experience, he called up his sometime classmate or friend, at least from the Beijing Film Academy, Chen Kai-ge, and said, don't fester away as an assistant director in Beijing Film Studio. If you come to Guangxi, you can make films. You can do it right away. They're clamoring for projects. So Chen Kai-ge was excited by this and rushed to Guangxi. And in Guangxi, he made his first 2 features, both of them in collaboration with Zhang Yimou. First was Yellow Earth, the second was The Big Parade, both of which had quite significant impact both in China and further afield, abroad. Chen Kai-ge then joined this mass movement to Xi'an, and he made his 3rd feature for Xi'an, again at the invitation of Wu Tianming. But I think we have to pause for a moment in this history to stress, because people nowadays really would find this hard to believe. There was incredible opposition to the films made by the 5th generation directors in China at the time. The authorities didn't like them, senior filmmakers didn't like them, and there were many very hostile attacks from within the film establishment to these films. Yellow Earth was endlessly debated at the time as being a film that patronized peasants. It showed the backwardness of peasants in China. It was therefore completely unacceptable. So he can't be allowed to do this, And so the film was, for a time, blocked from release in China. It was also blocked from foreign screenings and foreign sales. Both of those were overcome within a fairly short space of time. It happened fairly quickly. But the controversies went on. Great reluctance to distribute them, great reluctance to sell them abroad, great hesitation from the Film Bureau, a lot of censorship wrangles, a lot of arguments, and almost fanatical hostility from many older generation people. Famously, there were only 2 major figures who strongly supported the new generation. One was Huang Zongying, the wife of the actor Zhao Dan, herself an actress, who was very vocal and very impassioned in defending the 5th generation directors. And the other was the veteran communist director Ling Zefeng, both of whom spoke very strongly, forcefully for the films and for their innovations. Other people were extremely hostile and extremely negative, and all in favour of banning and suppressing this cinema. So these were very difficult times. Wu Tianming turned out to be an incredibly resourceful producer, defending the films, defending the filmmakers from these attacks, and still continuing to produce them, while at the same time making more commercial films to keep the studio in good shape financially. So Zhang Yimou, after photographing these films for Chen Kai-ge and others in Guangxi, was invited by Xi'an, by Wu Tianming, to come to Xi'an to shoot Wu Tianming's new project in, I think, 1986, I believe it was, a film called Lao Jing, Old Well. And it's based on a novel. And Zhang Yimou read the novel, and he said, okay, I'll come and photograph this film on condition that I'm allowed to direct afterwards. You'll give me a project as a director next. Well, as it turned out, Old Well was a very attractive project in many ways, and it was a film that Zhang Yimou not only photographed but also starred in. It was his first major acting role. And that was not foreseen, I think, when the invitation was made, but he agreed to act in the film. And actually, I don't want to say anything bad about Wu Tianming, who was a wonderful man and an extremely decent man, sadly now dead. But I think it's also quite well known that Zhang Yimou had a strong influence on the way the film was directed. He didn't direct the film, it is definitely a Wu Tianming film, but Zhang Yimou was the one who continually pointed out, we don't have to do it like this. That's the old traditional way of doing it. You can cut. You don't have to show him going from A to B. You can just cut from A to B. And the journey is irrelevant. It just slows the film down. You don't need to see it. So simple elisions in the narrative like that were suggested by Zhang Yimou and accepted by Wu Tianming. Old Well ended up looking like a significantly more modern film than most of the 4th generation films from other directors of that time. Anyway, it was because of this negotiation with Wu Tianming that Zhang Yimou got to make his own first feature right afterwards. So he'd be barely finished acting in and photographing and perhaps covertly co-directing Old Well, that he got to make Red Sorghum.
坐轿不能哭，哭叫兔叫没有好报，盖头不能掀，盖头一掀必生事端。
And Red Sorghum is based on two stories by Mo Yan, who was a Shandong writer. They were quite popular at the time. Zhang Yimou has never felt a desire to really reflect his own personal experience. I think many of the fifth generation directors have based their films in various ways on their own experience, at least in the late 1980s. That's not really true of Zhang Yimou, whose experience of the Cultural Revolution and its aftermath was a bit different from theirs anyway, because he came from what's called a wrong class background in China. He was both his father and his uncle, I think, were officers in the Kuomintang army. So Zhang Yimou, from early childhood, had been at the bottom of every list. He came from the wrong class background, therefore enjoyed no privilege in any aspect of his life. But he had learned from early youth that if he wanted anything, that he had to beg for it, basically, and that included, as it turned out, his place at the Beijing Film Academy. He was deemed to be too old for it, but he appealed directly to the minister and said, "Please let me in, here are my photographs. I've been selling my blood to survive, please, you've got to give me a break." And the minister, rather heroically, said, "Yes, okay, you should." So he joined the cinematography department despite being overage, and despite being artistically qualified, but not in other ways qualified for it. And so his history in life had been like that. He had learned to have to fight for everything and to beg for everything. Nothing was handed to him. No opportunities were given to him directly. So he chose these Mo Yan stories. He must have discussed it with Wu Tianming. And he was able to make the film exactly as he wanted. And that included finding a new actress for the central role. Jiang Wen, the main male actor in the film, was by then already becoming established as a major figure in Chinese theatre and cinema. He was known and recognised as one of the leading male actors of his generation. But Zhang Yimou wanted an equally striking and powerful female lead in the film to play Jiu. And he went to the Beijing Drama Academy and picked Gong Li from the students there. So at the time that she made Red Sorghum, I think she hadn't even graduated. She was still technically a student and was very young when she made the film. So he made the film, as I said, that he wanted. It was a film visually very striking, in every respect. I think it's highly visual, more so than most of the other fifth generation films. But the key thing that Zhang Yimou wanted to express in the film, which was conspicuously different from other fifth generation films, nearly all, was sexuality. It's a film right from the first scene about sex. It's about the desirability of Gong Li. It's about the way that men lust after her, how she responds to that lust, how she her sense of herself changes as she becomes more powerful, more assertive. She rebels against her father. She rebels against the elderly husband, a leper whom she's been forced to marry. She rebels in various ways, becomes a rebellious figure, and that is her making. She becomes a boss. She becomes a proper female boss, and she also rebels against the man who tries to dominate her, the man played by Jiang Wen. So it's a very striking female role of a kind not seen, I think, in other Chinese films of the time, or even before that time. It's a measure of Zhang Yimou's judgment and success that he found a young, inexperienced actress who was capable of doing it. capable of expressing, who was not shy of expressing sexuality, of being both a desired object and herself desiring, a woman who was clearly interested in sex, not embarrassed by sex, happy to take part in sexual play, as it were, in the course of the story, and who could stand up to a relatively much better established male actor, who it must have been, on the face of it, very intimidating for her to act with Jiang Wen, who already had quite a big reputation, certainly in both theatre and film circles. And she not only survived and managed to do it, but she actually did heroically well. She did magnificently well. In fact, she made an enormous impact from the beginning. If we think about other fifth-generation films of the time, if we think about Chiang Kai-shek's first two films, for example, Yellow Earth and Big Parade, they have no sex in them at all. If you think of his third film, the film he made at Xi'an, just before Red Sorghum was made, it also has no sex in it. There's only one female character in the film, apart from some little girls in the school. And she's only appearing at the very beginning of the film, and she's not presented as a potential partner. There's no sense that the central character, or indeed anyone else, is going to have a sexual relationship with her. So sex is absent. The only woman in Yellow Earth is the peasant girl, who is also to be married off to a much older man, and who rebels against that, resists it. In Big Parade, all the central characters are male. It's about a male army platoon, so it's basically a single-sex film. The only women who appear in it at all are some farm workers who you see fleetingly in the margins of the story. So sexuality is off the agenda in Chiang Kai-shek's film. It turns out it's a story for another time, but it turns out to be an issue for Chiang Kai-shek, which he struggles in the 1990s to deal with. But it's anyway, the point I'm trying to make now is that if you look at the early films, and it would be equally true of Tien Zhuang's films, there's no sex. The sex is it's just off the agenda. It just doesn't come into the story. You don't get the sense that the director thinks about this or cares about it at all. It's not an issue for the writer or the director. Nobody has given it any thought because they don't think it's important, or they don't want to deal with it. It's repressed, suppressed in various ways. Zhang Yimou is the exact opposite. He wants to go in for it 100%. For him, sexuality is a key thing, and the main attraction of the Mo Yen stories that are the basis for the film was that they deal with peasant sexuality in a very earthy, very straightforward, very unembarrassed way. So there's a lot of nudity in the film. I mean, it's not nudity in the sense of explicit sexualized nudity, but the male characters throughout the film are largely undressed. They're mostly at least topless, and there are scenes where they say, "Oh, somebody's coming, you better get dressed now," and things like that. So there's a frank acceptance, at least in the dialogue, of nudity, of undress. In the play of expressions, particularly on Gong Li's face, there is again an excitement, an acceptance of sexual desire, a willingness to submit to it, and an enjoyment of experiencing it. And that is just not matched in other films. I think the only other fifth-generation film I can think of that comes anywhere close to this is Hu Mei's first film, which is called Army Nurse, Nure Lo, which takes the point of view of a woman and, amongst other things, details her feelings for some of her male patients. She has sexual feelings, clearly, for some of the patients that she has to treat, and the film is very frank about her sexual desires. But I think that and Red Sorghum are the only two fifth-generation films from that period in the late 1980s which frankly face up to sexual questions. Red Sorghum is, of course, not a realist film. This is a very stylized film, a very artificial film. And there is never any sense in the film that this is an accurate picture of peasant life in Shandong in the 1920s, 1930s. At least not until the Japanese arrive towards the end of the film. The Japanese army and the atrocities committed by the Japanese army are, of course, based on the historical record. But until that point, until the Japanese show up, the film is not a realist film. And Zhang Yimou, in fact, has never been very interested in realism. At least he wasn't until he made a film called The Story of Qiuju, which was realist for a point, because by that time he'd been criticised so much in the press in China and in film circles in China, particularly over his relationship with Gong Li. And he made a film in which he played a peasant and which was extremely close to documentary, a lot of it, to the extent that a lot of it was filmed with hidden cameras even. In the film, so it was impossible for anybody in authority in China to criticize him for making a film that was close to the people. This was absolutely a film that was close to the people, and it was his answer to all the criticism that he made films about sex and films about experiences remote from ordinary people's experience. But in fact, he was very committed, I think, to films about fantasy in some sense. And although nobody would ever claim that the action of Red Sorghum is close to realities of peasant life in the 1920s, 1930s in Shandong or anywhere else in China, there is a clear sense, I think, that this is how he would like to imagine that it was, or how it should have been, perhaps. He wants to mythologize it. He wants to turn it into a kind of rather exaggerated, rather heightened depiction of the way people behaved, the way people thought. Now, it is very likely that he's helped, of course, by Mo Yan's source stories, because women like Jiu, played by Gong Li, were few and far between, I would suggest, in China of the 1920s. Certainly in villages, maybe in Shanghai, you can find very liberated women who have very progressive and modern attitudes and a sophisticated cosmopolitan education. But Jiu is not a character like that. She's just a village girl who is fighting her father. Her mother seems to be dead already. She asserts herself very powerfully and becomes a kind of boss, a lady boss. I don't suppose there were, in reality, many figures like that. I don't suppose there were many figures like Jiang Wen either, the Jiang Wen character, who doesn't really have a name in the film, but who is introduced at the beginning as the only sedan chair bearer in the opening scene, carrying Zhou to her wedding, who is not part of the staff of the winery, the place where the Red Sorghum wine is made. He's the one interloper, the one outsider, and he becomes, of course, the key figure because he's the one who, in effect, seduces her. He's the one who initiates overcoming the fake bandit who appears in the opening scenes. He's the one who confronts the real Sanpao, the bandit, who turns up a bit later on. And he becomes Jiu's husband or partner, let's say, and becomes a key figure, of course, in the resistance against the Japanese. So, again, I don't suppose there were too many real people like that in Shandong in the 1920s, 1930s. I think it's a fantasy figure. Now, the visual look of the film, you were asking about the red, it's not just the red, it's the red and the blue. The film alternates between daytime scenes, which are predominantly and overwhelmingly red and orange in colour, the colour balance, the colour bias, and night scenes, which are overwhelmingly blue, strongly blue. So you cut consistently all the way through the film from red biased scenes to blue biased scenes. The night scenes are unnaturally, exaggeratedly blue, usually with a moon hanging in the air. The last time you see it, the moon is actually green over a blue landscape, so it's completely stylized and artificial. I've never yet seen a green moon myself, so I think this is Zhang Yimou's invention. This turns out to be a rather simple trial run for the things he will do in later films, because in later films, right through until the wuxia films that he made quite a bit later, he plays very creatively with colour. with colour coding. He assigns particular colours to particular characters and then follows it through in a very stylized way. Something I think he learned from Kurosawa in the later films. Kurosawa had made a film called Kagemusha, The Shadow Warrior, which is a historical piece about a double impersonating a feudal lord. And the film had done quite well internationally, but what he discovered was that foreigners couldn't tell the enemies apart from each other. They all looked so similar in their uniforms and their armour that it was very hard for foreigners to make any sense of it. In the film, they're differentiated by the Chinese characters, the kanji as they call them in Japan, on their banners. So you can tell, if you can read Chinese or you can read Chinese-Japanese, you see immediately who is who, what they're doing. But most foreigners don't have that access. So for his follow-up film, which is a film called Ran, loosely based on King Lear, also a historical drama, also rather fantasticated, Kurosawa didn't make that mistake again. He colour-coded his armies. So one army would be wearing red, another army would be wearing blue, another army would be wearing green, and so on and so on. So you can tell at a glance who is who, and you can tell who is fighting who, and you can easily see the factions involved. So Kurosawa had come up with the idea of colour-coding, and I think Zhang Yimou learned that from him. But already in this first film, in Red Sorghum, the title is a giveaway. Zhang Yimou wants to use colour in an expressive, creative way, which is not tied to reality. He wants it to be an exaggerated use of colour, a creative, expressionist use of colour, if you like. To be honest, it's not fundamentally different from what he and Chen Kai-ge had done in Yellow Earth. It's set in a different part of China, but it's in Yellow Earth, the yellowness of the earth. The film is set in the Loess Plateau in sort of Midwest China, I guess you'd call it, in the area not far from Yan'an. The ground is indeed yellow, so it makes perfect sense to call it Yellow Earth. And the Yellow River runs through it and plays an important part in the film as it happens. But they made a creative decision while shooting Yellow Earth that they would use the yellowness of the landscape as a signature feature of the images. And its dryness, furthermore, because as we know, the film ends with prayers for rain. The question asked at the end of Yellow Earth is, is the rain god going to deliver for us, or is the Communist Party going to deliver for us? It's an ambiguous question which is left unanswered at the end of the film. I think when Zhang Yimou was able to turn director himself with Red Sorghum, it's not an accident that he went for another colour title. So you could think of this as a counterpoint to Yellow Earth in a way, Yellow Earth and Red Sorghum. But he picked on red as, in his eyes, I think, the colour of desire. So when the girl, later to be dubbed Jiu, which happens to be, it's her name because she was born on the 9th day of the 9th month, but it also happens to be an exact homophone for the word for wine or alcohol, which is pronounced identically, even to the same tone in Chinese. So it's there's a synthesis of the woman, the wine, and the red, because the first time you see her in her bridal palanquin being carried off to her leprous elderly husband, she's dressed in red. She's supposed to be wearing a red veil across her face, although she tears it off and only puts it on again when a stranger intervenes. And she's in a red palanquin. So the first several times you see her, she's all red. I mean, the image is suffused with red because she's wearing red, she's in a red palanquin, or sedan chair anyway, being carried in that. So red is by far the dominant element. And for Zhang Yimou, I think it becomes synonymous with desire. He uses red, as he did again in Raise the Red Lantern, Da Hong Dong Long, from 3 films later, to signify desire. It's the colour for him, I think, of desire. So, since this is a film largely about desire, at least for the first hour it is, He, as I've said, he, in a very stylized way, switches between red-dominated images, or with some elements of orange and yellow, and blue-dominated images for the night scenes. And he knows that there's a very extreme contrast. I mean, there are no two colours more opposite to each other than red and blue. I mean, the red has very little blue in it, and blue has very little red in it. So they are opposite primary colours in a way. And I think he exploits that by producing a kind of duality in the storytelling. He wants you to feel the heat of desire in the daytime scenes and the coolness of desire repressed or to some degree shut out in the nighttime scenes. This coalesces around the character of Lo Han, who is the foreman of the distillery where the wine is made, and who does a heroic job holding it together, does a heroic job making her the boss when Big Head Lee is killed mysteriously off screen. And Lo Han is also the man who leaves when it becomes clear that the Jiang Wen character is going to assert himself and basically take over. So at that point, Lo Han leaves. We hear much later in a voiceover, at the time the Japanese arrive and start perpetrating their atrocities, that Lo Han became a communist. It's the only concession in the whole film to a communist presence in the film. And Lo Han never gets to say anything communist. He doesn't seem to represent the Communist Party in any very coherent way, but it's the one concession the film makes to a presence of the Communist Party in the 1930s as a resistance force against the invading Japanese.
18里红搁在门口了。
Lo Han is seen in both daytime scenes and nighttime scenes, but his disappearance is at night. And somehow he feels like a character who belongs more to the repression of desire side of things than the indulgence in desire. As Jiang Wen is a man who lives very robustly by his appetites, is very frank, very open, very physical, very earthy. This is the man, after all, who pisses in the wine, who and makes, in consequence, a great vintage, it turns out, that year. Lo Han is the exact opposite. He's a cautious, steady, quiet, observing man who does the right thing at every turn. And whatever feelings he may have for Jiao, the girl, he doesn't express them, and he certainly doesn't indulge them. And he leaves when, a new husband turns up or a new partner turns up for Jiao and installs himself in the house. Lo Han sees through the making of that year's wine and then leaves, quietly leaves, slips away in the night. So he seems to belong to the blue side of the film, just as the Jiang Wen character belongs to the red side of the film. I think that's part of the thinking that informs Zhang Yimou's planning of the movie. He carried it further, as I said, in later films. Red Sorghum was made in 1987, right after they finished shooting Old Well. And I think Zhang Yimou must have had it in mind already. He must have had I'm sure he'd already met Mo Yen and discussed with him the possibility of adapting these stories. So he went into it very quickly. Anyway, soon after for him the crucial thing was finding locations, sorghum fields, which was obviously vital, and finding the actress, which was also crucial for him. And it had to be somebody, it had to be a new face, he thought. There was no existing established actress who could take this role, he felt, and bring to it the kind of qualities he needed. He went straight into it in 1987. He finished it rather quickly. The film had a not very long shooting schedule. We said earlier that Wu Tianming struck a careful balance between Shangye Pian commercial films and Yishu Pian. And he looked basically to the fifth generation people to make Yishu Pian. That's what he expected to get from them. But in this case, I think he understood very quickly that this was a bit different, that this was a film with the potential to appeal to a very large audience in China. And he and Zhang Yimou discussed this and came up with very strong strategies, things that had not been done in China ever before, to promote the film on its Chinese release. So they went on a roadshow. They arranged premieres in the big cities of China, and they went along. And they stood on stage and met the audience at the first night. Zhang Yimou sang the songs from the film, Hao Jiao and all this stuff. He sang live in the theatre to a karaoke backing. And it was, nobody had done this in China before. This was a completely new form of marketing. It was clearly inspired by things that already happened in Hong Kong and in Taiwan to some extent, and of course in the Western world too. But it hadn't been done in China. It had never been an issue. Nobody had even thought of doing this before in China. And it paid off big time, especially because of the great beauty of Gong Li, who was, of course, paraded on the stage as well. And everybody was gawping at the sight of this famous new beauty, who became a film star overnight because of her role in this film. So we have a very curious situation where the film is I think the film probably would have done it anyway. The film would, I'm sure, word of mouth would have been very good for this film in China because it is much more entertaining than most Chinese films of 1987. All this hype and promotion definitely helped, not least because it was so new. I don't think it would have worked if the film itself had not been as strong as it is. If the film were weaker in any way, it would have been less effective. Anyway, fortified by the success of the film in the China market, where the film was by quite a long way, it was the most successful fifth generation film ever released in China in the late 80s. They looked to the foreign market. And the film festival at that time that was most open to Chinese film was Berlin. At that time, Berlin was still an isolated pocket in the middle of East Germany, a communist East Germany. So Berlin is a little island in the middle of it. And Berlin was very conscious of its status as an island of capitalist freedom in some sense. And when it ran the film festival, it bent over backwards to be friendly to communist countries. So the Berlin Festival famously showed lots and lots of films from East Germany, from Russia, from Cuba, from China, from communist states, because they wanted to prove how inclusive and open they were to these things. They wanted to suggest that they were not, the menacing bad West that was going to, threaten the communist East. They were going to be very friendly, very warm, very embracing, and they would give prizes in the festival to these films to prove how open-minded they were and how tolerant and accepting they were. If you look back over the history of Berlin Film Festival, you'll see what I mean. It's very hard. Online, you can easily find lists of prize winners from the 60s, 70s, 80s. It's been like that for many, many years. So they were open to films from China, and they had shown, I think, rather boring films from China earlier in the 1980s. They jumped on Red Sorghum because it was far more dynamic, far more exciting, and far sexier, it must be said, than any Chinese film they'd seen before. So they were very, very happy to show it in competition in Berlin. And the film, I was there in Berlin that year, and I think it's fair to say the film was a kind of sensation. The film, because nobody, of the very large number of people, there's something like 2,000 accredited journalists in Berlin, many of them not very serious-minded, most of them like showbiz journalists rather than serious film critics, but it's a very international, cosmopolitan press corps. And there are many, many other people. There are distributors, buyers and sellers of all kinds present in the market in Berlin. And many, many filmmakers, of course, are there. And so the film plays in competition in Berlin and goes down a storm. People are, I can't say overwhelmed by it, but people are very, very impressed because they have never seen a Chinese film like this before. You have to remember that at this time, the earlier fifth generation films like Yellow Earth, like Horse Thief, quite a few others too, but those would be the most famous examples, have not been very widely seen in the West, partly because their releases were delayed by the Film Bureau in China, which was initially hesitant about letting them go out overseas. So Horse Thief, for example, never had a big premiere in a major festival anywhere in the world, actually. It was not made available to anyone. It might well have had one had it been seen, had it been made available to festival programmers, but I don't think it was, so it didn't have that benefit. But in this case, they were happier with it. The Film Bureau, that is, the Chinese authorities, they were happy to send the film to Berlin, and Berlin was more than happy to show it. They jumped on it. So it went down extremely well, I think, in Berlin. The hesitations that you heard that year were all about the last 25 minutes of the film, the Japanese arriving and invading and carrying out their atrocities. Everybody agreed that this was a change of tone in the film, that the beginning was quite mythological, quite fantasticated. But once the Japanese arrive, which were presumably in the late 30s, the film doesn't give us dates, but we have to assume that this is towards the end of the 1930s, the tone of the film changes. It becomes more melodramatic. It starts to use very melodramatic gestures. Although visually it's very much of a piece with the earlier part of the film, and it maintains the red colour scheme, the dominant red colour scheme, and red is deflected from meaning desire to becoming the colour of blood. It becomes the colour of atrocity and torture, actually, and it shades into flame, whereas before it was the colour of desire. It shifts. There's a tonal shift, which is very carefully engineered by Zhang Yimou, I think. But I think Western audiences found this less persuasive, partly because they're going to be less open to foreign nationalism. I mean, the film is very nationalistic. In its tragic finale, it becomes very pro-China, anti-Japan, in a way that has not been the case earlier in the film. And I think foreigners will be less impressed by that because, another person's nationalism is always something a bit alien to you, just as I think, a Chinese audience would find British nationalism very alien. So it works both ways. And people, I think, regretted the shift from a kind of mythic storytelling in the first hour of the film to a still rather stylized, still rather fantasticated storytelling in the last 25 minutes of the film, but nonetheless something closer to historical fact because of the behavior of the Japanese and what happens in the attempt to overthrow the Japanese. And I think people regretted that to some degree. So it probably mitigated the film from being seen as a 100% classic. People felt that there was a conceptual problem about the way the film is resolved. But I think there was unanimous, what I heard anyway, was unanimous enthusiasm for the first hour or so of the film and its particular storytelling, its particular performances, its particular approach to sexuality, its particular exuberance, and its sense of a creative freedom, actually. The balance between very freewheeling camera work and construction, the way that for example, the sedan chair ride at the beginning, as the young girl is being carried to her unwelcome husband, which is very free and very fast cut and very exuberant, I think it's fair to say. Much play of faces, much play of looking and sneaking glances and that kind of thing. Compared with the more formal compositions once you reach the winery, where very often there are carefully framed, very symmetrical compositions. The moon right over the gate outside the winery, for example, which comes back, I think, 2 or 3 times in the film. The praying at the altar of the blessing the New Year's wine in front of a Buddhist figure on the wall, a Buddhist painting on the wall. These ceremonial scenes, which are done in a much more formalized way, very controlled, organized compositions, And you can see, well, we know from Zhang Yimou's later work that he does like both those things. He likes both the freedom and exuberance of very freewheeling camera work and action following people moving fast. And he also likes the formality of tableau compositions, particularly with lots and lots of people forming uniform patterns in the image. And both of those are already present in Red Sorghum. So I think that side of the film was hugely oppressive internationally. And whatever people may have felt about the Japanese invasion part in the last 25 minutes. The result of the success in Berlin is that the film was immediately sold for distribution in many, many Western countries. It was picked up pretty much overnight. And I think that that success began in Berlin at the time. There's a market in the Berlin Festival. China Film Corporation, I think, was still the monopoly distributor and sales agent at that time. And for the first time in their entire lifetime, I think, the organization's lifetime, they did business. They suddenly found themselves overwhelmed by people rushing to their stand in the market and saying, can we buy this? We'd like to buy this. Are the Finnish rights available? Are the Swedish rights available? Are the German rights available? Are the British rights available? And they did business. I don't think they signed deals on the spot in Berlin. They were sensible enough to take it back to Beijing and think about it. But for the first time ever, there was mass international interest in a new Chinese title. And in consequence, in the following year, this happened at the beginning of 1988. By the end of 88, I think the film was already appearing in many other festivals. It had been invited on to other festivals around the world. And it was beginning to start to appear in distribution. I think people were beginning to look at distribution possibilities and rushing the film out. It happened partly because of the sheer brio of Zhang Yimou's visual style, the freshness of the storytelling, particularly in the first hour of the film. And it has to be said, I mean, this is going to sound a little bit sexist, I'm sorry, but it's the sheer appeal of Gong Li. Gong Li was clearly presented in this movie as a kind of film star, in the way that many, many women before her had been in Hollywood films. And the film presents Gong Li as a star figure, and she was pretty much immediately accepted universally as a star. So her career from that point on was cast in iron in a way. I mean, there was to be no more difficulty. There was whatever she did. I mean, as it happened, she chose to stick mostly with Zhang Yimou, and her next several films were made with Zhang Yimou. And it wasn't until quite a bit later, into the 1990s, that they broke up and went separate ways. But for a period of, 4 or 5 years, they were closely associated with each other. She did very little work away from him, and she was a star. There was no question that people went to see Zhang Yimou films in the expectation of seeing another extraordinary performance from Gong Li. So I think the international success of this film paved the way not only for Zhang Yimou's subsequent films with Gong Li, but also for probably a wider, more popular appreciation of Chinese cinema. As Yellow Earth and Horse Thief and films like that, which are more yishupian, more art films, began to conquer a more discriminating elite audience in art house cinemas, so Red Sorghum began to conquer a broader popular audience because the film is more popular. I remember Chen Kai-ge came to me in 1987, just before he went to the States, and he said, "Have you seen Zhang Yimou's film?" I said, "Sure, I have." "What did you think of it?" I said, "Well, I have complicated feelings about it. I thought it was very impressive in many respects, but I have some reservations." And he said, "Didn't you think it was rather commercial?" Like this was some great sin. And I said, "Well, of course it's more commercial. Obviously, yes. This is compared with Yellow Earth or some very stylized art house film. Obviously, this is a much more gutsy, much more dramatic, much sexier, altogether more entertaining kind of a film. Sure, I mean, I don't think that's a crime, personally, Kaiko. For him, it was a betrayal of purity. I doubt he still thinks that after making films like Wu Yi, but at the time, that is what he said.